All right, welcome back. I want to do a really quick video here. It's during my lunch break, so I don't have too much time. There might be interruptions here and there, so please bear with me. Okay, so I want to address the document known as Amoris Laetitia, put out by Pope Francis in, I think, 2016. And I want to explain both why, actually, I think Michael Lofton, his position on the Magisterium is probably right. So to, in part, defend him, ironically, against some of his Catholic detractors, but then also to say he's also partially wrong in the kinds of harmonizations he gives. And this is actually a huge problem for the Magisterium. So what is Amoris Laetitia? Well, it was an apostolic exhortation that Pope Francis gave to address the situation, in part, in chapter 8 specifically, to address the situation of divorced and remarried Catholics. Now, the historic stance of the Roman Church has been that if you are divorced, if you divorce, you cannot, and you have been validly married, and especially if you've been sacramentally married, you cannot remarry. It is considered invalid if you remarry someone else other than the person that you've divorced, and that's considered this violation of the natural structure of marriage. Now, why is that a problem? Well, today in our world, sadly, a lot of marriages end in divorce, and you have a situation in which a lot of professing Catholics have remarried. They might have kids in these second marriages. These unions might have been established over 20, 30 years. And so the question becomes, if they're invalidly married the second time, so it's not a real marriage. Well, what are they supposed to do? Well, Pope John Paul II historically answered that by saying, well, if they're unwilling to completely separate, they should live as brother and sister, meaning they shouldn't have sexual relationship at all. They might live in the same house, but they live as brother and sister rather than as husband and wife. Now, this doesn't apply to marriages that can be annulled. For annulment, you really are technically only supposed to be able to get an annulment when a marriage is invalid in the first place, when it doesn't meet the criteria for being a marriage in the first place. So if one spouse, for instance, didn't intend to keep the union for life, that would be an invalid marriage, but then the marriage would be declared to have never been valid in the first place. Okay, so how do we think about this document that was released in 2016? Well, in Amoris Laetitia, the claim was that in chapter 8, particularly section 301, paragraph 301, and others, and we'll go through this document, Pope Francis argues that, and this is what sort of generates the controversy, that many of those who are in these situations can't simply be told to either separate or to refrain from intimacy. And so to quote this part right here, this is from paragraph 301, for an adequate understanding of the possibility and need of special discernment in certain irregular situations. By irregular, he's denoting these cases in which people have divorced and remarried someone else, they have children, they've been perhaps remarried for a very long time, and their marriage is technically invalid on the basis of canon law and Catholic teaching as a whole. The Church possesses a solid body of reflection concerning mitigating factors and situations. Hence it is, can no longer simply be said that all those in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. More is involved here than mere ignorance of the rule. So the conditions for mortal sin typically were you had to know that it was a grave matter, and you had to have sort of willful engagement with this matter, knowing its full severity. And if you don't do that, right, and you sin nevertheless regarding a grave matter, it's not necessarily mortal. But Pope Francis is saying here that he's not just talking about those cases in which people are ignorant of what the Catholic Church teaches. He says the subject may know full well the rule and yet have great difficulty in understanding its inherent values, or be in a concrete situation which does not allow him or her to act differently and decide otherwise without further sin. So what is he saying there? Well, Pope Francis is saying that you might encounter a couple where if you're saying, okay, either separate or don't have intimacy, that actually might impel further sin in certain situations. So consider, for instance, maybe someone has been remarried. They got married really young. They intended to stay together. The marriage broke up for whatever reason. And, this person, maybe the husband, he gets remarried. And he lives this life like 30 years or so faithfully. And maybe he finds out the teaching in year 31. And maybe he has young kids. So I don't know, however you want to cash out. He's married for 10 years. He has kids. Whatever. So he has this history of faithfulness, and he's recommitted his life to the church in the wake of the second marriage. And these kids, they know the parents as just mother and father. That's the only way that they know those parents. They don't really know the parents' prior history or their dad's past or whatever. What Catholic teaching, according to Pope John Paul II, demanded was that that couple lives as brother and sister. They don't have relations with each other, which means the kids, seeing that, would not see their parents, their biological parents, express affection, the affections of a husband and wife towards each other. It might affect the environment that they grow up in. You might actually be doing damage to the kids long term. So is the claim. That's what Pope Francis is arguing. We can think of these sorts of situations where this might be really problematic, this might be damaging to the kids, and so in that sense involve a parent in further sin insofar as they're not able to provide adequate care for their children. So what do we do with that, right? Pope Francis's recommendation here is that it might not be the case that all of those people, and he's talking about fringe cases, as Michael Lofton rightly points out. So here's what he's not saying, right? There's some critics that will say, well, he's just legitimizing divorce and remarriage and allowing it willy-nilly. That's not true. And Michael Lofton does a good job pointing this out, that he's talking about fringe cases. So fair enough. Okay, but here's the problem. Even in these fringe cases, Pope Francis is saying, one might know the rule. They might come to know the rule. And yet, if they were to live into that reality, they were to separate or live as brother and sister, that might involve them in some further sin that might be damaging to the children. And so, because of these extenuating circumstances, they might not be in a state of mortal sin, even though they're living in this union, which they know is technically invalid, and they might be having relations. They're not necessarily living in a state of mortal sin. Okay, now there's an infamous footnote here I want to pull up. It's in footnote 351. This has been endlessly discussed. And Pope Francis, this is sort of the context. He says this, that people in these situations, while they're in a objective situation of sin, which they might not be subjectively culpable or fully so, and a person can be living in God's grace, can love and also grow in the life of grace and charity while receiving the church's help. And he says that they shouldn't be made to feel as though they're excommunicated or outside of the body of Christ. And footnote 351 reads as follows. In certain cases, this can include the help of the sacraments. Hence, I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture chamber, but rather an encounter with the Lord's mercy. I would also point out that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. So here's the problem that generates. Let's say you go to the confessional and you confess this, but you recognize that this union that you're in might, in breaking it up, that might inflict further damage, maybe on the children or whatever. Pope Francis is saying that doesn't necessarily exclude you from taking the Eucharist. Okay, I deeply appreciate Pope Francis's intention there. But here's why, at least from my perspective, and admittedly I'm an outsider, but from my perspective, this does not make theological sense. And so this is where I push back on Michael. It doesn't make good theological sense for this reason. Consider the following analogy. Suppose you have two people that are cohabitating, and they are living in adultery. And they go to a pastor, they confess this, they want to become Christians. The advice there is not, but maybe they don't have money to get married, or for whatever reason they have to put off marriage. The advice is not, well, you can actually keep sleeping together and take the Eucharist and just repent every time, right? The advice is, okay, get married and pursue the Lord together as a married couple. It would not be legitimate for that couple who's cohabitating to say, well, like getting married would deprive us of financial resources or whatever. Like it's just beyond the realm of doability without causing significant upset for one reason or another. Now, in Rome's eyes, historically, those who were divorced and then they got remarried, it's not just that they committed a sin, but they're now married. It's that marriage actually isn't even valid. And so the person who's cohabitating, who's in this irregular situation, is actually in the exact same position as someone who's cohabitating. So the idea then that you can take the Eucharist while being in a state where you're aware that according to the teaching of the church, the apostolic teaching, you're actually in a state of adultery. That's pretty big tension there. That's a pretty big problem. Okay, so a lot of Catholic theologians have pointed this out, and they've said, okay, well, Pope Francis is just wrong. Michael Lofton, his attempt now, I'll critique his attempt to reconcile this, and then I'll point out where I think he's right, and then how this generates a problem for Catholicism as a whole. Michael Lofton's sort of attempt to reconcile this is he points out that the document doesn't necessarily say someone should just take the Eucharist without confession. They should confess first, maybe. And it's appealing to a principle found in Aquinas that appeals to mitigating circumstances to make this judgment. Okay, so here's the problem. Mitigating circumstances don't make, and the document itself, Amoris Laetitia admits this. Michael Lofton actually interestingly says this on some level too. It can't make self-conscious sin not sin. So again, for instance, consider this case of cohabitation, right? Or consider the case of a same-sex attracted couple. They got married, they experienced a conversion to Christ, and maybe they've adopted children. Well, breaking up, that is going to hurt the kids. But it's the right thing to do, I would argue, as a Protestant, as an Orthodox Anglican who believes the Bible, that's probably what they should do then. And that will have ripple effects. That has consequences, and that's painful. And the church should walk alongside people who are suffering and struggling in those situations as they attempt to live a life of holiness. But if they're unwilling to do that, they're saying, well, separating would be damaging to our kids, and we should show these expressions of intimacy towards each other, even though it's technically not right. Rightfully, then, they should be barred from the Eucharist. And most Protestants who are Orthodox would bar such a person from the Eucharist. If you view an invalid marriage along the exact same lines, then the exact same principles apply. So the admission of such people to the Eucharist, no matter their circumstance, is this legitimizing of sin. You take the Eucharist with the expression to fight sin, to utterly fight sin. But if someone says, I can't, that would be damaging, right? Then they haven't actually let go of their sin. Okay, so now that's where I push back on Michael. That this pastoral guidance It couldn't actually be true. It couldn't be good or legitimate in other situations like same-sex unions. So it shouldn't be legitimate in this case either, if Catholic teaching is consistent. Now, one could say, as some of Michael's critics have said, that Pope Francis is just wrong. This is an exercise of his non-infallible magisterium, and so he's just wrong, and we can reject this. Okay, here's why that's not so simple, and here's where Michael's actually right. If you're a Roman Catholic, if you've been paying attention to magisterial documents, the Professio Fidei, issued by the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, Donum Veritatis, and of course Lumen Gentium, I believe, in the Second Vatican Council, then you'll know that the faithful are obligated to obey the Pope even in non-definitive teaching. They're not necessarily obligated to give assent of faith, so no one's necessarily obligated to say, yeah, that's a good pastoral judgment, yeah, that's true, but you are obligated to give it adherence to it, to give what's called religious submission of mind and will, such that you're living in a way that's in accordance with it and shows respect for that judgment. And the claim of Donum Veritatis is that divine assistance is given to the Pope even in his non-definitive magisterium, his non-definitive public exercise of his teaching office, which an apostolic exhortation is an exercise of the papal teaching office. Divine assistance is promised such that it makes it possible. It legitimizes this claim that the faithful must adhere to the Pope's judgments. At least give religious submission of mind and will to the Pope's judgments. So Michael's claim historically has been that the Pope is, at least even in his authentic but non-infallible magisterium, is safeguarded from promulgating error that would be destructive to souls. I think he's absolutely right about that, contrary to even some of his Catholic critics. Because think about this. If divine assistance is given to the Pope, even in his non-definitive exercise of his authentic magisterium, such that you have to give religious submission of mind and will, and you have to adhere to it, how could God obligate the faithful to adhere to something that would be destructive to their soul? That's a massive problem. That God could never obligate someone to adhere to a teaching or to give submission to a teaching that would destroy their soul, that would be destructive to their soul. They shouldn't be obligated to accept or to not oppose a teaching that would be destructive to their soul. So given the Professio Fidei and Lumen Gentium, what you have to, the minimum you have to say about Amoris Laetitia, you don't have to say it's infallible, but the minimum I think you do have to say, if you're a Roman Catholic, is that it's not destructive to souls. So even if the pastoral practice is wrong, even if it's not the best that it could be, you have to say that it's not destructive to souls. Okay, here's the problem. If a pastor told, let's say, again, a couple living in same-sex union, a polyamorous couple, someone who is cohabitating, if a pastor told those people, you don't have to break up because your doing so will lead you into further sin, or could lead you into further sin, or they make that judgment, such a judgment would be destructive to that person's soul because you're allowing them to live in a state of sin. You're allowing them to engage something that's intrinsically disordered and intrinsically destroying their soul by deforming their soul out of alignment with God's will and his goodness and his image. But if the Catholic teaching is true, that those who divorce and then remarry someone else, given that their first marriage was valid, are actually, they've engaged in an invalid marriage. They're basically at that point cohabitating. Right? They're in the exact same position as two people living in a same-sex union with adopted children. They're in the exact same position as two people cohabitating, and for whatever reason being unwilling to break up the union, engage in a legitimate union, whatever it might be. And if you say that that's okay, right? So the same-sex couple, it's okay if they stay together, because they have adopted children, or at least they can receive the Eucharist, and they might be conscious of the rule, but they're unwilling to separate because of the damage that could inflict on their children. If you tell them that, that is legitimizing something destructive to their soul, which is allowing them to continue in this sin. Similarly, if the Catholic teaching were right, and those people who are in a second marriage are they're living in adultery, right? They're fornicating, then Pope Francis is legitimizing a practice which Paul says excludes you from the kingdom. So that actually constitutes then a falsification of Lumen Gentium's claim and the Professio Fidei's claim that the Pope is so assisted such that the faithful ought to at least give adherence and submission of mind and will to his teachings, because the faithful can never be obligated to give submission and assent to something that would be destructive of their soul. We can put this another way, in the form of a modus tollens. If it were the case that divine assistance were given to the Pope, such that even his non-definitive magisterium demands adherence and submission of mind and will, then it would be the case that he could never promulgate something destructive to souls. And our support for that premise is the fact that the faithful can never be obligated to give submission of mind and will to something that would be destructive to their soul. Premise 2. The Pope has promulgated something that would be destructive to the soul of the faithful, given the assumptions of Catholic teaching, and add that clause, of course, to the first premise. Therefore, Lumen Gentium, the Professio Fidei, the claims about divine assistance given to the Pope are false, and that constitutes actually a falsification of the precise nature of magisterial authority, the claims for magisterial authority promulgated at Vatican II and reaffirmed in the Professio Fidei and Donum Veritatis. All right, I hope this was helpful to you. Let me know, Michael, if you do end up watching this, please feel free to respond. I'd love to chat about this. I'm totally open to that. And I hope that this helps advance the conversation between Protestants and Roman Catholics. And my heart is that I hope that this moves us closer to the point where the Reformation succeeds and we can be united again as one visible institutional church. All right, thank you so much for watching. God bless.